Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to look at how to use the Russian army on the tabletop. Now, I know that's the title of the video and it sounds very certain and definite, but it's important for me to point out at this very early stage that I'm not saying this is how you must use them. Only we're going to look at the special rules, the positive special rules and the negative special rules for the Russians, and we're going to look at what roles they can perform particularly well on the battlefield and which they should try and avoid if possible. At the end, I'm going to have a very quick summary on how to face the Russians, so keep an eye out for that if you're not a Russian player. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to give a shout out to friend of the channel, Jay Bazra, who runs NI Miniatures YouTube channel, so pop over there, give him a like. He's got some good videos up there. It's slightly different content to what I do, but I don't think it's an and/or, I think it's an and-both situation. He's trying to get off the ground a painting competition that will be for charity, so either check out his YouTube channel, that's n.i.miniatures, or check out his Facebook group, which is the Great British Paint-Off. It's going to be painting a single British figure over a 10-minute period to see who can do the best one. It's going to be a good cause. He's not finalised all the details yet, but head on over to his Facebook page and you'll see the details there. I'm going to use it as an excuse to paint my Portuguese semaphore station, which has a British officer attached to it. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the Russian army. Now, the first thing that I want to do is just have a general overview of the historical roles that the Russians played on the battlefield. We'll then look at how well they can perform in attack or otherwise, and how well or otherwise they will perform in defence. So I want to set the historical scene first, so we've got something to refer back to when we're talking about their abilities on the battlefield. Now, the Russians are often seen as a defensive army. You've got the great battles of 1812, the battles of Smolensk, or the Battle of Borodino being probably the most obvious, in which they played a very defensive role. You've also got earlier battles, such as the Battle of Austerlitz, in which they occupied the Pratzen Heights, so they were fighting a defensive action there against the assaulting French. And you've even got things like the Battle of Eylau, where the French, I mean, it was a bit more of a seesaw, but the most famous event came from a French attack. So the Russians have a bit of a reputation for being very good defensively. Marshal Ney once said that you had to shoot a Russian, and then stab him, and then push him over to make sure that he was dead. So even contemporaneously, I think that probably should be, then the Russians had a very strong reputation for being tough, solid, stubborn defenders. But that does not mean that they couldn't attack as well, particularly as the wars drew to their close, 1813, 1814. The Russians very much went on the offensive. I'm thinking particularly Leipzig here. They were very aggressive there. The French were dug in. The Russians had to throw them out of those fortified villages. Also, the Battle of Kulm. They were a little bit more defensive, but again, they had that counterattack aspect as well. So, from history, we can see that the Russians were usually defensive, but they were able to do aggressive action as well. And it's at first we'll discuss the Russians on the attack. Now, I'm going to talk mainly about infantry. I am going to cover cavalry and artillery as well, but the infantry is what Napoleon called the queen of the battlefield. That's the most important element. The thing is with cavalry need to be attacking. Even if you're performing a defensive role, the cavalry still need to be fairly aggressive. So that kind of goes without saying. Artillery, due to its lack of maneuverability, is the opposite, obviously. That needs to be fairly defensive. Even if you're softening up the enemy before an assault, your artillery can still be a fair way back. So we're going to be mainly concentrating on the infantry here, but I will make reference to cavalry and artillery as well. So, on the attack, we can look at the stats for the Russians. Now, the most important stat for trying to move troops in black powder, in my opinion, is the strategy rating of the generals. And not only the strategy rating of the generals, but also the widespread availability, or otherwise, of bonuses to that number. Now, the Russians, I'm going to be using all the stats and rules and things like that, are all taken from the Clash of Eagles supplement. Now, I know not everyone has the supplements for their armies. I say it every time I talk about them, and I'm going to say it again here. I cannot recommend highly enough that you get the supplements for your armies. Not only does it give you the extra rules for your army, but it also adds that Napoleonic flavour to your black powder games. The way I think about it is, imagine the black powder is a rice pudding. It's nutritious, but it's boring, doesn't really taste of anything. The stuff that you add to your rice pudding, your strawberry jam or your raspberry jam, stuff like that, that's where the supplements come in. And that turns this sort of bland mush into something that's really tasty and, you know, still gives you the nourishment of a good war game. So that's my analogy out of the way. Black powder is like rice pudding. So there you go. Now, one of the problems that the Russians have with their command is that it's very low. So if you look at the army lists on page, he says, flipping to the army lists, on page 150, you can have a staff rating of 8, which is pretty good. But there is a note that says half of your Russian brigade commanders rounding up must be staff rating 7. Now 7's not bad, it's not disastrous. On average, you should pass a command roll. But on average, you should pass it on the roll itself. So, you know, you shouldn't be trying to make super advanced moves. Now you can get a bonus. This is particularly useful when on the attack, because if you order your Russians to charge, they get a bonus of +1 to that. If your troops are in column of companies, they also get +1, and they get to move for free, 1 move, if you fail your command roll. So the Russians in attack, they can keep rolling forward. It can be fairly slow because you can't guarantee that you're going to get those movements off, but they will keep rolling forward. Compare that to, say, a French commander who can be 7 or even an 8. He gets +1 for being in column of attack. He gets another +1 for pas de charge. So suddenly that strategy rating 9 guy, strategy rating 7 becomes a strategy rating 9 guy. And on average, he's now rolling 2 under, so he's moving twice as fast as your troops, on average. When we talk about these dice rolls in this video, we can only really talk about the averages, because, you know, you're always going to end up with that double 1 or that double 6 that just comes out of nowhere. So we're going to try and talk about the averages as much as possible. Now, there is a way that the Russians can get bonuses to their strategy rating. As I alluded to earlier on, they can form column of division, not column of companies, like I said earlier on. So sorry about that, column of division, and that's basically attack column. That's the same as what the French have got, but without the pas de charge. So they only get the +1 to their strategy rating. So that makes them, you know, if you're a 7, that makes you strategy rating 8, which is not bad. If you're on a road, then you can go up to 9. You get an extra +1 to your strategy rating if the units you're commanding are currently on a road. So not bad. You can get it up to possibly 9. Now there's another downside, though, to commanding troops to attack. We talked about in the video on how to attack that it's very important to attack en masse, to keep your troops together and have the units supporting each other. Now for the Russians, they're sort of double nerfed on this situation. The first one is that they can only give brigade orders if the 2 battalions that they're ordering are from the same regiments. Now I say 2 because the regiments only had 2 battalions. Let's say Guard, they had 3. But anyway, we'll just go with line. We'll say they had 2 battalions. So the problem with that is it means that you're ordering sort of a half brigade at a time maximum. Now a Russian brigade had 2 regiments of 2 battalions. So you got 4 battalions, but they're from separate regiments. So for argument's sake, if I want to attack with my brigade, I have to issue 2 orders. I have to first order, for argument's sake, the Archangel Regiment. So the 2 battalions of the Archangel Regiment will move forward 2 moves. If I'm successful in that, I can say the 2 battalions of the Ekaterinburg Regiment will advance 2 moves. So if I succeed in that, great. I've got all my 4 battalions, they're all next to each other, they're all providing mutual support. Fantastic. However, the problem comes if I fail. Usually if I fail the second one of those 2, so if I pass the first one, my 2 battalions zip forward, then I fail the second attempt, then the other 2 battalions, so in this case the Ekaterinburg Regiment, they stay back, and suddenly instead of having 1 clump of 4 battalions, I've got 2 smaller blocks of 2 which my opponent can then isolate and destroy, particularly if they've got cavalry. We'll come more into that in a second, but if they do, they can force some of those battalions to form square, and then that separates them for the rest of the game. Now, we did say, however, that if you are in column of companies or column of attack, column of division, you do get that one free move. So you can slightly mitigate this by just ordering your guys to move one move at a time. This means that Russian assaults can be quite slow and very predictable. The opponent's going to know where those troops are massing, and they're going to be able to have time to react. Maybe move a reinforcing brigade into position, or perhaps maybe try and spoil your attack with some cavalry of their own. So just be aware of that. While you can keep up a consistent movement of one move per turn, you are ceding the initiative to the opponent, and that's exactly how the Allies lost the Battle of Austerlitz. They were in a better position, but they lost by holding that high ground. They lost all the initiative, and the French were able to surround and destroy the army in detail. Well, I say partially surround, I should say. It wasn't like Cannae or anything like that. So, low strategy rating means that the Russians, despite the fact they can get some bonuses, are best off not trying anything too exciting. Just go for those 1 or 2 move orders at the absolute maximum, and even then, I'd be very careful of doing that. Go for those 1 move ones, move forward as a giant green wave at the enemy, and try and keep together. I briefly mentioned about the brigade business. You can only order 2 battalions if they're from the same regiment. So, when it comes to making your army, then try and double up those battalions as much as possible. A brigade that consists of 4 battalions from 2 regiments is much more appealing than a brigade that makes up 4 battalions from 4 separate regiments. Equally, if you're forming non-line infantry brigades, if there is the option to upgrade to reliable, absolutely go for it 100% of the time. Just go for it. You're going to find that over the course of the game, it really pays off. Now, it's 8 points per battalion if you're talking about combined grenadiers. You can upgrade regular line infantry to reliable as well. It's 8 points for them. Probably wouldn't. I would probably leave it for them. But those troops who you need as your fire brigade units, the ones who need to go to where a disaster is about to unfold, you need to make sure they get in position. So I definitely recommend upgrading them to reliable. It also means as well that you can take that strategy rating 7 and not be crippled by it. Somewhere that I absolutely would recommend that you take strategy rating 8, however, is with cavalry. Now, things with infantry, it's quite easy for them to get a bonus to their strategy rating. They can get +1 just by being in column of attack, and to be fair, if you're going to attack, that's the best formation to be in anyway. So, bonus. Cavalry can't get that though, so I always recommend taking the highest strategy rating you can for cavalry, because it's far more difficult for them to get those bonuses. Also, say the infantry, they can be in column, they can be on a road quite easily. Cavalry, if they're in column, well, that's fine, but they've then got to form into line, and because they move so quickly, you won't necessarily have the time to do that. So you want them to be battle ready, in line as soon as possible, which means they're not really going to be on that road. So get the strategy rating 7s on your infantry brigades, particularly the grenadiers. I'd upgrade them to strategy rating 8. I'd give them reliable, but I'd take the 8s on your cavalry. That's if you want to be aggressive. The other part of the tripod that we haven't talked about are the artillery. Now, the Russians have a special rule for their artillery, which means that they have to be emplaced, so in fortifications, on the hills of their deployment zone. So it's a bit weird. It's very odd, but so that's a special rule. So that's not too bad, because the Russians can take extra heavy guns, which means that even if you're attacking for the majority of the game, the enemy should be in range of your extra heavy guns. But just be aware that the enemy could withdraw and you won't be able to move your guns forward because they're in place. So just be aware of that when you're positioning your troops. Also remember that if your men cross the line of fire, you'll probably still be able to fire your cannons, that's fine. but you'll be at an additional -1 to hit. So if you're at long range as well, suddenly you're looking at hitting on 6s, maybe 5s if the enemy's in column, but it's a lot less effective than you would hope because you're only rolling that 1 dice at long range as well. So the positioning of artillery is far more important when you're on the attack than when you're on defense because you can't move them. And the enemy's not going to be coming towards your artillery. Also said though, the artillery almost becomes pointless, meaningless when you get to that stage because you're hitting on 6s. So it's worth doing. You're fishing for those 6s. You might disorder the enemy, but just be aware that if you're attacking, you're going to be limited in the amount of artillery that you can have. That's where things like horse artillery batteries can be really good, or just lighter foot batteries. You can move them forward. So if you know the battlefield that you're going on, just make sure you take more batteries and you've got hills. But if you don't know the battlefield, then just be aware that could be an issue for you. So we've talked about the difficulties the Russians have of getting to grips with their opponent. How good are they once they do get to grips with them? Well, luckily, they're very good. Pretty much most of the army, well certainly most of the infantry, have tough fighter. And that means that they re-roll one of their misses in close combat. So if you're charging in, you're hitting on a 3, you're re-rolling one of those dice. So, again, on average, you should get 2 misses, and you re-roll one of those, which should be a hit, so you should get 5 hits. So that's pretty strong. Now, because of the way maths works, the fewer dice you roll, the more effective that re-roll is. So for Grenadiers, they get 7 dice in close combat. They're also Elite 4+ as well. We'll come to that in a second. But because they get the extra dice, the tough fighter is actually less statistically useful on them than it is on regular line troops. That said, I certainly wouldn't sniff at it for the line troops as well. The Elite 4+ that the Grenadiers get mean that they're more likely to be able to make that combat. But, if they are disordered when they're charging the enemy, then that Elite 4+ doesn't really help them. It only helps them if they're out of combat. So you probably don't want them to spearhead an assault because you want them to make use of that rule, which means that they can be where you need them to be in second or subsequent turns. And finally, for their special rules, this is a 2 negative special rules. The first one is that they suffer -1 to their shooting. Now that means that they're obviously a lot better in close combat than they are firing, which means that the assaulting is what you want them to be doing. That is made slightly more difficult, not really, but slightly, by their second special rule, which is lacking initiative. It means that they can't use their initiative moves unless it's to charge the enemy. Now, if you're assaulting, 9 times out of 10, that's what you're going to be wanting to do anyway. So that becomes a bit of a non-problem. But it's something just to be aware of, that if you're wanting to get in there, then, maybe do a bit of, shuffling around, then maybe it just can be a little bit more difficult. Again, especially with cavalry, if you want to use that free turn to get round the flanks or behind the enemy without necessarily charging them, then you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to actually order those guys. We spoke about earlier on the brigade orders only being available to 2 battalions from the same regiment. Unfortunately, again, for cavalry, they don't have that luxury. So you're going to have to be ordering those units individually, which means that to do any sort of developed, exciting outflanking maneuver with Russian cavalry is quite difficult. Speaking of Russian cavalry, we also need to quickly touch on Cossacks as well. Cossacks are an interesting unit. They're not actually very good. They've only got a 5+ save, and crucially, they're not allowed to charge the front of unshaken units. So if you can get them around the flank, then that's quite good. But, yeah, don't expect too much from them. They're quite good as speed bumps for your opponent. Put them, 19 inches in front of your cuirassiers or whatever. Let the enemy charge them, and then you can possibly charge them in your turn. It's particularly good if you're fighting the British, because they have to break through, whereas French or whoever, they could just drop back. So, it's difficult to know what to do with Cossacks. I think I'm going to have to do a whole separate video on them when I've got a little bit more experience with them. So we've looked at the Russians on the attack. Now we'll switch our focus to looking at the Russians in defence. I have to say, this is where they absolutely excel. I talked about them attacking. They're okay at it, but it's in defence that they really come into their own. Now, why is that? It's because it plays up to all their bonuses and minimises their weaknesses. So we looked at one of their main weaknesses being their low strategy rating. Strategy rating affects a few things. So it affects things like forming square if you're being charged by cavalry, if you go by the supplement rules. But mainly it affects how far you move, how fast you move, what manoeuvres you can do. If you're in line on top of a hill or in some entrenchments, doesn't matter, you're not going anywhere. You could be strategy rating 1. Doesn't matter because you're not actually going to go anywhere. So that negates one of their major problems. One of their big advantages is they've got that extra point of stamina. Now, if you have an objective, if you set the mission for the French to, for instance, exit the enemy's edge of the tables, they've got to break through, for argument's sake, then they've got to engage those Russians in close combat if you put the Russians in the way. So that means that that 4th point of stamina is going to be in effect. Something that's also good about that is, let's take, for argument's sake, a quick example of a French bonus special rule, the pas de charge. So they get their +2 strategy rating and +1 to their morale save if they're in column of attack. So that's great. But in order for that to be the case, they have to be in column of attack. That's what we call a situational buff. It doesn't always occur. It occurs situationally. In this case, if you're in column of attack. The Russians, they have what's called an active buff, or, an everlasting buff, which means that they always have stamina 4. It doesn't matter what formation they're in, whether they're disordered or in a wood or whatever, they've always got that 4th point of stamina. So they're inherently better because you don't need to meet any criteria for them. It's just baked in to your unit. So having that is really, really good for them. Again, they do suffer from their lack of being able to shoot effectively. They can get outshot. Now, especially if you're playing an ahistorical matchup, if you're playing British versus Russians, the Russians are going to be in for a bad time. They're going to need to attack. Even if they're defending, due to the scenario, they're going to have to come to the British. Because all the British are going to do is stand 17.5 inches away and just blaze away at the Russians and, and probably kill them all eventually. So you either need to instigate a time limit, which means that the British have to close, or the Russians are going to have to come at you. So that's, one of the problems with defence is, as I mentioned earlier on, you give the initiative to the enemy. That's something that the Russians kind of do anyway. Even if they're attacking, they cede the initiative to the enemy because they have to do it so slowly in order to stay together. So, because of that, at least if they're in defence, they can set up their lines, they can set up their mutually supporting battalions and things like that. So, I would suggest that the being in defence maximises their benefits, their stamina 4, their tough fighters, things like that, minimises their weaknesses, their low strategy rating, to an extent their lack of firing ability, but you need to be careful not to cede the initiative to the enemy. That's where your cavalry can come in. And another really good way of forcing enemies to come at you is with the artillery. Okay, the enemy's infantry, they can be blasting away at your infantry, but if you can outnumber them in artillery, particularly if you've destroyed their artillery, then that can be very useful. Not even necessarily destroy it, you can run it off. That can be a really good use for Cossacks, particularly if the enemy artillery is limbered or has gone past you in some way. So I think it's difficult because you don't want to give the initiative away to your opponent. When I do the video on the French, I'm going to talk about how they need to be hyper-aggressive, seize the initiative and keep the initiative. Anyone who's seen my Waterloo video, the greatest game that we went to, will know that that was my main criticism of the French commanders there, myself included, is that we lost the initiative. We gave the initiative to the Allies and we never took it back. And that was why we lost the game, ultimately. It's also worth pointing out that the Russians, as part of their army list, can buy entrenchments and earthworks. So, as well as having to entrench their artillery, they can actually also have their infantry defended. Now, this is where that 4th point of stamina really comes into its own, because it means that it takes exponentially more shots to take that 4th point of stamina down. If you're saving on a 4+, then you only need to hit the enemy 2 more times to get rid of that final point of stamina. If they're saving on a 3+, you need to hit them 3 more times. And if they're saving on a 2+, then you need to hit them sort of 4 or 5 more times. It's a bit more squirrely, that maths. But yeah, no. So it's important, if you are the Russians, if you're intending on being defensive, then I would suggest that you buy your entrenchments. Now, this means that unless you're playing a scenario and you don't know, if you're playing a pickup game, you're picking a list, then you need to decide when you're writing your list whether you want an aggressive army or a defensive army. The two are going to be very, very different. I'm going to do a separate video on some sample armies. Let me know if that's something that you'd like to see. I'm not necessarily planning on doing it in this series. It might be a separate one. But yeah, let me know if you want to see me sort of suggesting army lists for different scenarios. I don't necessarily mean scenarios as in, the attack of the 3rd Division at Salamanca, or the assault on the Great Redoubt or something like that. I just mean scenarios as in for if you want an aggressive army or a defensive army. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was going to briefly cover off on how to play against Russians. Really, it's just sort of do the opposite of what we've talked about here. So we've seen that they lack maneuverability, so you want to get around their flanks, you want to get around their rear. Not always easy, especially if they've got entrenchments and they've got that dug-in high ground position. But that's what you want to try and do. If you can't physically get around the flanks, you need to try and drive the flanks in. So things like a heavy infantry assault, using things like the middle guard or young guard, or even massed artillery can be quite useful. Speaking of massed artillery, the chances are the Russians are going to outnumber you and outweigh you in their artillery. So you want to try and minimise the effects of that. I would try and have as many units as possible in open order, drive them out in front of the army, and then have the columns going up in support of those skirmishing troops. The Russian player, if he knows what he's doing, will still aim his artillery at your columns, but hopefully they'll take less fire from the Russians as you're going in, because those light infantry battalions will have already plinked off those hits, maybe shaken them, maybe disordered them. Cavalry-wise, the Russian cavalry is pretty good. It's fairly standard. If you can outnumber them, then that's great. Other than that, I would try and use specialist cavalry if you can. Particularly if you're French, I would be looking at matching your opponent's cuirassiers with your lancers. That's going to be a common theme in these videos. I think lancers obviously were designed to be anti-heavy cavalry, and they work an absolute treat in Black Powder, so I would be looking to do that. I'd also be looking to try and get those flank charges off. Maybe, see if you can break through that front unit. If it's a light unit like Cossacks or Hussars, smash through them, and then hopefully you can get into the cuirassiers or the dragoons behind without them being able to countercharge. So that's a very quick guide into how to select a Russian army. I haven't gone through army lists yet. I might do that in a separate video. But how to play the Russian army, my suggestion is a defensive army. If you come into Napoleonic Wargaming and you don't know anything about the armies, and you say, right, I want an army that's aggressive, that's going to take the fight to the enemy, that's going to crush them beneath my mailed fist, I don't think the Russians are the army for you, I'm afraid. I think if you want an army that is stoic, it's not going to go anywhere, it's going to stand and be, a real pain for your opponent to break down and break through, then I think the Russians are for you. Ultimately, I would always suggest go for the army that you think is coolest. If that's uniforms or a particular personality, or you like the country that they're from, or even just you think the flags look cool, I would always suggest that you go for that first. But that said, if you spent a lot of money and more importantly a lot of time and effort on an army and it doesn't work in a way that you enjoy playing the game, then there's a risk that you've wasted all that time and effort. So I would suggest, closing statement here, the Russians are primarily a defensive army with heavy infantry involvement supported by cavalry. That's all. Join us again for next week as we continue Russia Month. Thank you very much for joining me. See you then. Goodbye.